Sounds good. Well, welcome everybody. I'm Sarah Marino, and I'm part of this fantastic panel today. We've done, David and Jennifer and I have done 2 webinars so far, and we have received so many questions at the end that we decided just to do a Q&A for this one. And we decided to invite 2 of our friends. So Alister Benn and Alex Noriega are joining us today. And we are going to do introductions and talk a little bit about our photographic philosophies, so you'll get a little bit more information about all of us before we get started. But today our focus is generally going to be photographing nature, small scenes, and expressive photography. But once we open the Q&A up at the end, then you can ask pretty much any question that you'd like us to answer. Likely we won't be able to get through everything, but hopefully we'll be able to get through a lot of questions today. So our agenda is going to be this welcome, which is happening right now. And then we're going to do, as I mentioned, introductions and a little bit of photo sharing. And then we had a lot of questions submitted before the webinar today. So David is going to facilitate our discussion there. He's consolidated those questions, and then he's going to kind of do a little round robin between the 5 of us so that we'll all have a chance to weigh in. And then we'll start accepting the live questions through the Q&A through Zoom's interface. So that's our plan for today. Just a couple of quick reminders. So as Zoom is set up, make sure that you set the chat to all panelists and attendees if you want to communicate with everyone. So it's always nice to see the discussion going in the chat, but we want to make sure that you can see what everyone is saying. So down at the bottom, you can see a little drop-down box, and make sure you change that to all panelists and attendees if you want to communicate to everyone. If you want to communicate just to us panelists, you can also change that as well, but make sure you change it back at the end or once you send that message. Also, make sure that you submit all of your questions and answers in the Q&A section, not in the chat. Since there's a lot going on and we have a lot to look at in terms of the Zoom interface, we want to make sure that we don't miss any questions. So make sure you use that Q&A function. And then Zoom during the day sometimes can get a little overwhelmed. So if there are any technological glitches, just remember that you can log out and then log back in, and sometimes that will fix the problem. And if for some reason there's a massive technical glitch on your end or our end, just know that this webinar will be recorded, so you'll be able to watch it later. So I think with all of those things, we can get started with the introductions. So I will start with David.
Oh boy, me first, huh? Hey everyone, I'm David Kingham. I run the website Exploring Exposure, which is where we have like there's like bugs flying around here, sorry. We do like our photography workshops there, and we have lots of blog posts and videos on post-processing and stuff. And so you want to go check that out. And I also run the Nature Photographers Network, both of these with Jennifer, and that's a great community that you want to check out. Just focused totally on nature photography, and have a great critique section, so definitely want to check that out too. I'm originally from Colorado, and I've been traveling full-time with Jennifer for the past 4 years in an RV, and right now we're just settled down in Denver waiting out this whole pandemic thing. And yeah, I think that's about enough about me.
Well, here's your first photo.
Okay. So this one is from Death Valley, and I think I didn't really practice what I was going to say about these. So it's just a nice intimate scene in the dunes during a windy day. So there's a lot of atmosphere, and with a really soft color palette to kind of accentuate that, and all the different layers going on with that. Yeah, I'm terrible about talking about my photos, but and this is another one that I intentionally went with a really soft color palette and soft contrast here. This is in Yellowstone, in order to really show off the textures and just the feeling that I got from this place. So yeah. This one was taken in the mountains of Colorado, and the subject really here was this ring that I found with the corn lilies going around this flower, and that was really the subject of the photo, was how the the ring encapsulated that. I'm not sure the word I'm looking for there, but yeah, I think that's good.
Great. Thanks, David.
Yep.
How about you, Jennifer?
So as David said, I'm the other half of Exploring Exposure. I'm originally from the Midwest, a little south of Chicago, and I am a geologist by degree. And then I went and worked in veterinary medicine for 14 years after that. And then finally, I was a hobby photographer for about 3 years during that time, and then just needed a break from life. Kind of went through a big life change and decided to move out to Colorado, and I met David. And full disclosure, we actually met on a workshop. I was one of his students. That's a question I get asked a lot, so there's your answer. And we have been traveling in a travel trailer around the American West full time for 4 years, and we haven't killed each other yet, so that's I primarily like to focus on natural abstracts and smaller scenes. I put a lot of emotion into my photography, and I like to speak with my emotions. And yeah, that's pretty much all there is about me. So I really like to work with the small, kind of underappreciated moments in nature and the fleeting moments in nature. So this is a scene from southern Colorado a few falls ago. The sun was just getting ready to set behind the mountains, and the sun was shining one last ray of sun on these aspen stands. And my eye went to this little stand because I enjoyed the way the trees almost looked like they were kind of stepping out into the light, perhaps maybe like on a stage, and just the nice division between the dark and the highlights. But I like to use a lot of metaphors, and I anthropomorphize a lot with my subjects. So again, I thought these trees just kind of looked like they were part of an audience, kind of watching the sun go down as well. And again, I like to tell stories with my images. This is probably my third favorite tree in the world. This is in Yellowstone National Park. Just a lot of my photography is led just by exploring nature and taking my time and slowing down and not having expectations. So I arrived at this location 2 o'clock on 2 o'clock in the afternoon, harsh midday light that a lot of people don't like to work with, but it was making the mist from the falls really backlit. And I just felt it told a little story with this tree. The name of this photo is called Forsaken, just because he's really the only tree on this rocky outcrop. It just kind of looks like he's been forgotten about and left. So I kind of gave it that name for that reason. And then, like I said before, I like to focus on nature's natural abstracts and really kind of take my time to craft my imagery. So this is the Virgin River in Utah with the blue sky reflecting, and the orange glow is actually from the canyon walls. And this was slowed down to about a 1/4 second. I know that question gets asked a lot. I like using a 1/4 second because you still get that nice painterly look with the water, and you still hang on to some of the texture. So that's this one's name. I think I named this one Brushed because it reminds me of a canvas that someone has painted brush strokes on. And those are my images, and kind of a little bit about my creativity and my photographic style.
Great, thanks, Jennifer. So my introduction is next, and as I mentioned at the top, my name is Sarah Marino, and my business is Nature Photo Guides, which I co-own with my husband, Ron Coscarosa, who is also a nature photographer. I do this full-time as a career, and Ron has another career, so he just does it more for fun these days. But we have written quite a few ebooks together. We do video tutorials, teach in-person workshops, and that kind of thing. I just transitioned to full-time photography in January, so it's been a little bit of an adventure, kind of totally retooling what I thought my business would look like. But I'm really glad that with technology and friends, I've been able to do things like this. So the 3 photos that I chose to share encapsulate, I think, the 3 most important things about my photography. So first, this photo is from Death Valley National Park. And I think that it encompasses my view of nature photography as a really expansive pursuit, which means that I'm incredibly fascinated with all things related to nature, and I want to be out photographing more than just at the golden hour, at sunrise and sunset, on days where really colorful clouds fill the sky. So that means that I do everything from the tiniest details all the way to the grandest of landscapes, and I present my work in color and black and white, and everything in between. The next photo is mud tiles from Death Valley National Park that have just this beautiful glow that can happen at twilight on clear days. So another lesson that there's photographic opportunities in any landscape and on any light and any weather. I also really like to organize the chaos of nature, and that comes out a lot in finding patterns and repetition. So this little bit of a very chaotic mud tile I found to be absolutely beautiful. And then this final photo is a seed pod, and if you walked by it, you'd say, oh, that looks like a giant weed, or it looks like a giant dandelion. It's a salsify seed pod, which is a pretty common wildflower here in the American West. But I really appreciate taking something that looks mundane to the average person and turning it into something beautiful through photography. So those are my 3 photos and a little bit about my approach to nature photography. And next we can go to Alex.
Hi, I'm Alex Noriega. I've been shooting for a little over a decade now, and I'm originally from the Midwest, and then I moved out to the Pacific Northwest, and just last year I transitioned to full-time living on the road in an RV with my girlfriend Taylor, and we've been at it for 6-7 months now, and we love it. So I offer in-field workshops, processing tutorials, and I'll tell you a little bit about my photography here. So the theme that you'll see in these 3 images is that I really like to exclude context, and that's kind of what this webinar is about, these smaller scenes. But I just like anything that'll convey a really specific atmosphere or a feeling of mystery for me, or whimsy or imagination. And I felt like this photo was pretty whimsical. The seemingly endless field of snow pillows and just the trees sticking up. That's actually 13 feet of snow there, and those trees, you're probably seeing the top 10% of them. So it was a really snowy winter. And this one's one of my favorite images. It's kind of funny. It's very similar to David's corn lily shot that he showed you earlier. I just liked how the ferns were kind of encircling that one flower. And I saw this at my feet on the way out from a pretty epic 3-day backpacking trip. And it ended up being my favorite image of the entire trip. Wasn't what I went in there for, and I just happened upon it on the way out, and it was, what a great find. I called it Sanctuary because it just felt like a sanctuary for this one flower. Protection. Then this last image. Oh.
Did I go too fast?
No, that's good.
Okay.
This last image is just light and form on the dunes. And the dunes are one of my favorite subjects for that reason. And I love the way that light reflects on dunes and the way the shapes come out. And this particular dune was getting super late light, so that's kind of the last couple seconds of light before the sun went below the horizon. That's it.
Great, thanks, Alex.
Yeah.
How about you, Alistair?
Hi, I'm Alister Benn, and I'm the only person here who's not from Colorado. I'm on the west of Scotland right now. I run a company called Expressive Photography with my partner, who is from Norway, and Christine. And we've been likewise putting a lot of our time and energy into our YouTube channel right now because we are somewhat limited with what we can do. So normally we're running workshops, and I also write a lot of ebooks, and education, I think, is one of my really key interests. I think trying to get photography education brought out of the 1970s to try and teach it in a more expressive and creative way, and trying to dig into the psychology a little bit more. Now, my 3 images this is called The Spirit of Tibet, and it was taken under the light of a moon. It's about a 7-minute exposure, and it's right on the border of the Tibetan Himalaya. I shamelessly have to admit that I was asleep when this was taken because I'd set up a long exposure to just carry on shooting all night, and this is what came out when I woke up. So yeah, but the processing was quite an interesting thing to do. But yeah, isolating small things out of big landscapes, and I consider this an intimate scene because it was taken at about 300 mil. Now, this was taken in the Gobi Desert, where I went 7 times over the last 3 or 4 years. And it's just another one of those examples where the world is filled with geometry and luminosity and contrast and textures and transitions between them. And I really think that all photography, whether it's intimate or expansive, can be encapsulated by these disciplines. And, for me, it's just geometry in this, geometry and light. So I love this type of thing. And finally, this kind of just proves that it's not about great light or great weather. This was taken in a complete blizzard on the west of Scotland. And I just kind of loved the way that this tree was just showing such incredible resilience. And a bit like Jennifer said, it's about finding metaphors. And those metaphors might not be explicit to anybody else, but if you see it, then that makes it a worthwhile thing, because I think it's our engagement with the landscape that really determines what photography means to us.
So, thanks, Alistair. So with that, we hope you have a little bit more context about each of our photographs and our approach to photography, so that when we go into the Q&A, you'll know a little bit more about us and the thought process behind our own photography. So David, are you ready with the pre-submitted questions?
Absolutely. Let's do this.
Okay.
All right. So this question came up a lot. This is from Ed McGurk, but also Ron Jansen and Ron May and some other people had very similar questions. So Ed asked, as a landscape photographer, when I'm on location scouting for images, I have learned to see the world through the eyes of a wide-angle lens. For small scenes, it seems that I need to unlearn how to do that and instead see the world through the eyes of a telephoto and or macro lens. So what tips and suggestions do you have for seeing the world through the eyes of a telephoto macro? And are there any approaches that make this easier to do?
Who's going to jump forward?
I know, right? We're all in.
I don't mind starting.
Okay.
All right.
I agree totally that it's very easy to get sucked into that wide-angled lens mentality. I mean, I had a 14-24 on my camera for years, and it was almost glued on. And it takes time to get conditioned into shooting with a wide-angled lens, because your foregrounds are only this wide. It's not about standing with your camera on top of a tripod. And I think with intimate scenes, rather than looking for intimate scenes, it's about what you notice first. And I tend to get drawn to, it's almost like a distillation of the thing in the environment that's speaking to me the loudest. What's the key thing, whether it's a tension point or a colorful thing or a geometric thing or some kind of juxtaposition. And it's just being open to sort of realizing that that might be a long way away or it might be at your feet. So I think rather than looking at everything simultaneously, it's almost to try and relax your vision to kind of allow the pinpoint of what it is within a landscape that you're engaging with. It's either one of five things: luminosity, contrast, geometry, atmosphere, or color. And that can be 5 miles away on the other side of a valley, or it can be on a tree in front of your face. Somebody else can go now.
My answer is kind of similar to that. I actually just did a presentation for the Out of Chicago online conference about contemplative photography. And the idea there is just basically opening up your mind to be able to see things that interest you. These little things in the landscape. And through practice, you can start to open up your mind and vision to be able to see these little flashes that are there all the time, but you're just not noticing them. So if you want to learn more about that, look up contemplative photography, and we might be starting like an email course on this too. But yeah, just to being able to notice these details, the light, the shapes, shadows, all these little different things, not just the grand landscape.
Oh, go ahead, Jennifer.
No, go ahead.
For real, go ahead.
No, for real, you go ahead. Sarah and I are.
Then I'll go. I'll be assertive.
Yes.
It's my goal for the last 2 years has been to be more assertive, so I'll practice it right now. I think I totally agree with what both Alistair and David said, and the thing that really helped me was not spending time with my camera, so just keeping the camera in the bag and really working on what am I seeing. So from the grandest of forms, like seeing that you have a mountain in front of you and a lake, and like how is the light playing on all of those really grand forms. And then from the grandest form, looking at things like weather, what is happening with the weather, what might be happening with the weather in an hour or 2 hours, and starting to learn how to anticipate some of those things and how that might change the opportunities. Looking at the smallest details, from the patterns that I might see in tiny grasses at my feet or plants at my feet, ripples on a lake, what's happening when the wind dies down or when the wind picks up, what's happening in terms of shapes and lines in the grandest forms and the smallest forms. What is the plant life that I see in front of me, from things like the biggest trees to the smallest plant life. So really starting to focus on pulling out all of those details, because the way that I see details in nature is that they're creating opportunities for a composition or for a photograph, so that the more you really start noticing the details, then you start having the ingredients for smaller scenes. That if you're only looking at the grandest forms of a landscape, then you're missing out on the opportunities for the smaller scenes. So it's really improving your observational skills. So for me, since I'm a fairly literal person, that process that I just went through worked really well for me as I was trying to expand my ability to see that type of, or to see small scenes in nature. Whereas if you're, I think, more like what Jennifer was describing as seeing emotions and metaphors in nature, Alistair mentioned metaphors too, that maybe the flash of perception exercise or contemplative photography that David mentioned might work better for you. I think it's just trying out a lot of those different approaches and then really improving your ability to see beyond the obvious that's right in front of you and the biggest forms that catch your eye.
Yeah, and I mean, to follow up, I agree with what everyone has said. Like Sarah said, just be curious about the world. There are many times that I just go for a walk without any camera gear, just to reconnect with nature and just kind of strengthen that bond. And, I'll use all my senses when I approach a scene. I'll even sit down, to use an example, like Yellowstone. Yellowstone, I always tell people, you get to use so many of your senses in one place. You can feel the steam on your face. You can hear the bubbles, coming up from the thermal pools. You can see the colors and, everything else. And sometimes just connecting with a place, sitting for a few minutes. What do you hear? What do you smell? What do you see? Things like that. It sounds really elementary, but it really works. Another thing that I did when I was first getting into smaller scenes is I would actually review some of my grander scene photos. And I would investigate all throughout the photo and kind of pick out little spots like, oh, there was a little bit of light on these trees over here. Maybe I could have, used my telephoto to zoom in on that. Or look at the stream down here. Maybe that was a chance to play with some longer exposures. And I kind of started picking out these little things that I wanted to work on in the future in the field. And one thing that I do, especially when approaching a scene, is I always do my little visual grocery list. So, here's this big grand scene in front of me. What do I see? What elements are standing out? Whether, like Alistair said, it's, the weather, the light, areas of contrast, things like that. And just really, slowing down, taking a moment to just really connect without your camera. And one last thing that I tell my students sometimes when we approach these larger scenes is I tell them, challenge yourself, get out your telephoto lens and literally, you can put it on a tripod, you can hand hold it and just scan your scene, because sometimes when you're looking upon the grand scene, you kind of get that tunnel vision for the grand scene. And when you have your telephoto lens out, you can really start to zero in and kind of pick apart the scene as, to see what little stories catch your eye. So in a nutshell, that's how I approach that and kind of how I made myself start seeing those smaller scenes.
Yeah, I can't say it any better than the rest of you, I think, but I think the overarching theme here is observation, and just think about what's drawing you to pull out your camera in the first place. My workshop students are usually surprised to see how long it takes me to pull out the camera. Like, I'll just leave it in the bag and just walk around and point things out to them. Look at this juxtaposition here when you stand here. Look at what the light's doing over there. And I think it helps just to notice those details, and also to get out of the paradigm of near far, like I need to find a foreground and then that's going to sit below like my mountain peak or whatever the most prominent thing in the scene is at a third, and then I'm going to have a third sky up above that. Like, get out of that and just start looking at light, form, color, juxtapositions, and there are more ways to compose a photograph than foreground, midground, background. Like, you can have frames or patterns. I mean, there's all sorts of different ways to lay things out in a compelling way on the rectangle that you have to work with. So I just think observe and really think about what you are drawn to in the scene. And I also want to add that I'm terrible with a wide angle lens. I don't see that way anymore because I haven't owned one for 4 years. So it's just about practice. Like, if you start thinking this way, you're going to get better at it. Don't be discouraged because it's hard at first.
Mm-hmm.
Can I just add one little final thing at the end there, which is that if you go into the landscape looking for things, you'll only find what you recognize. Whereas if you go into the landscape with an open heart and an open mind, and you will be the landscape will introduce things to you that you may not have recognized if you're going in with that template mentality that kind of Alex was talking about there.
Yeah.
All right. I think we covered that pretty well.
What a team.
All right. Nick has a question. What inspires you to be creative? If the answer is nature, as I suspect it may be for many of you, what specifically is it about nature that you find creatively inspiring?
Are we going to stick with the same order and just do it that way? I'm a very quick... If someone asks me a question, I get an answer very quickly, but I'm happy to wait.
I'll go.
For it.
Or you go. That's cool.
You go, Alex.
All right. I definitely nature, but I think the different moods of weather and light, and I think what really inspires me to photograph these things is when I can distill a scene down to the point where it exudes that essence. So this is kind of going back to the previous answer, in that, like, if you notice some detail that's drawing you and you have a grand scene and it's just a detail within the scene, the photo doesn't really give the essence of that feeling that you got. So I think whenever I'm inspired by a particular subject, like a tree that's just shaped in a really interesting way, I'm not just going to place that within a larger scene. I'll focus on that, or weather or light. I just want the photo to exude that thing that I was drawn to. So usually weather and light for me. But even though the scenes end up really small, or the subject itself, but I just want it to be all about that one thing. Did I lose the question there?
No.
I'm done, by the way. Go for it.
Maybe we should call, whoever answers should call on the next person.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yeah.
So
Sorry.
that we can keep it flowing.
Sorry about that.
So, I agree with what Alex says. And, for me, I think what inspires me is just telling those little stories in the landscape. I think this is why I'm so drawn to natural abstracts, especially, things like the natural oils on the ground, or the mud cracks in Death Valley, or, leaves on the ground. I like highlighting and showcasing those tiny little moments that people may ordinarily just walk on by. And I kind of like giving those moments, their time in the spotlight, because, they're just as important as, a big mountain with a big storm going on in my eyes. So for me, I think what keeps inspiring me is just those quiet little moments in nature, and especially those moments where I can insert my emotion or what I was feeling, or maybe trying to tell the story of what the landscape was feeling, is kind of what keeps my photography going and what inspires me. What about you, Sarah?
For me, it's the fact that every time I visit a new landscape and then get to know it more, I want to know more and more and more and more. Like, we own 2.5 acres of land, and we've lived here for a couple of years now, and every year I find a new plant that I had never seen before. And it's that kind of fascination with, so when I first bought this piece of land, it's like, oh, it has sage and junipers and pinions. Well, once you start looking deeper, after it rains, mosses grow under the sage. And there are these beautiful little tiny, tiny mountain ball cactus that are about the size of a golf ball that are blooming right now. And then we have a claret cup that we found recently that it will be blooming soon. our pinions had pine cones this year, and they hadn't the previous year. So it's that kind of thing that translating that to the places I visit for photography, it's just, I keep on finding new things that fascinate me, and I want to be able to figure out a way to photograph those things that fascinate me. How about you, Alistair?
I've forgotten the question. It's been so long. The thing that inspires me to be creative, I think, is my life. The fact that I can breathe and walk around this planet, and I'm always seeing things that fascinate me. So I think it's a sense of inquisitiveness and a sort of fascination with everything. So even though I'm a landscape photographer by career, I can just as easily photograph the roof of an airport, or the light shining off a glass building, or the way the light will play on a cheek or an arm, or anything in life that fascinates me and catches my eye. And earlier on, I said there's only 5 triggers, and there's only 5 triggers, which is luminosity, contrast, color, geometry, and atmosphere. It's usually one of those 5 things that will fascinate me enough to want me to get the camera out of the bag. And every time I get the camera out of the bag, I'm sketching something I'm fascinated with. And whether it becomes a photograph or not, that's a moment of my life that's been precious and absolutely worth living. David?
I think mine is similar to that, but I'll also say that I think being creative helps me express my emotions in a way. Most of you know, I'm not a good communicator, so I think I communicate better through my photos, and I can express some like deeper down emotions that like I'm not even aware of. So I think by opening up my mind and creative mindset to being, I'm just rambling, but yeah, I think that's the way that it helps me express that.
That's an excellent answer, David. And it's so important these days to allow those things to be said, is that we're losing sight of how important photography can be as an expressive medium for people who struggle to articulate repressed feelings, or feelings that they're not comfortable expressing, or to express the broader spectrum of our emotional output. Massively important point. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Next question comes from, I don't know how to pronounce it, Wyken. What are practical ways and practices we can do to improve our understanding and taste for colors?
You can start that one, David.
Oh, me, huh?
Did you have your fancy way of with processing that helps people?
I don't know. I guess my understanding came through just studying nature and seeing how the way the sun affects things versus things that are in shadow. So understanding those warm and cool tones by really paying attention to what you see out in the landscape. So most people, like, your brain is really good at neutralizing everything for you. So most people can't see blue shadows very well. And I think it takes time to develop that. And I don't know, I think beyond that, I'm not great with like the color wheel and stuff like that. So somebody else can answer better on that one.
You're going to nominate?
Yeah.
Well, I guess it's you then, Alistair.
What was the exact question?
What can we do to improve our understanding and taste for color?
Well, I'm just writing a book on it, funnily enough. So I better have a good answer for it. I'm writing a book called The Color of Meaning, where I'm looking at our understanding of color from a much more emotional and expressive viewpoint, and understanding that certain colors have both societal context and learned context. And I think it's very easy for us to grow up under the shadow of our learned and societal context. So we understand that sunsets are supposed to be glorious, and we respond to them because they're warm and fiery and energetic. And bluer, more subdued colors are a little bit more melancholy and a little bit more austere. And I think understanding the emotional relationship with color is what I think is the most important step forward. And also understanding that there's an experiential color palette, and that if you step over that line, people are going to resist your photographs to a certain extent. And this is where we get to the oversaturation question and things like that. So I think the best way to do it is to think about going to the optician and where they do that A and B thing, and move the sliders around and try and feel the difference between the colors, try and how it changes how an image feels. And you can do that globally using temperature and tint, or locally using the HSL panel. But I think experimentation and then building an emotional relationship with those color palettes is probably the best way to go. Jennifer.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Alistair is saying. You know, we're very visual creatures by nature. So we really respond to colors, and everybody sees different colors. I mean, you know, some people are colorblind, some people, like, I think there's a scientific fact that some women can pick up on slightly different hues of maybe pinks or purples or blues or something, I think I read. So it's all very interesting. But yeah, I grew up taking a lot of art classes. So I grew up appreciating, you know, analogous colors, complementary colors. And so I kind of naturally see those out in the landscape. But one thing I tell people to do is, you know, to really appreciate the whole spectrum of colors that Mother Nature gives us, is to actually just go out and spend time studying a landscape from sunrise to even sunset. And my students in Death Valley see this a lot on the dunes. So I like to say, you know, you go through about 5 or 6 different stages of colors and lights just on the dunes from sunup or from sunrise to about 9 a.m. in the morning. And you get those really nice, pretty twilight pastels, the blues and the pinks in the morning before sunrise. As soon as the sun, you know, crests the mountain, you start to get those real nice blues and golds. You get like about 5 minutes where the rim light just really is really nice and, you know, contrasty, and it's gorgeous. And then you start to get into a few of the deeper colors, and then, you know, you can work in black and white from there on out. And the same thing happens with sunset. And, you know, David and I know Sarah and Alex, we probably all do this, but we stay out past the actual sunset, because if you actually stay out about an hour after the actual sunset, you start to pick up on those twilight colors again. And as Death Valley is an example, the salt pans, the playas, the sand dunes, they're all very reflective. So they will pick up whatever color it happens to be in the sky. And some of the best conditions for that are actually those blue sky days. So, you know, I'm a big proponent of, you know, don't complain on blue sky days. There's so much to do if you just open your mind. And that's a perfect example. But nature is full of these colors, and a lot of it just takes time to study, you know, especially if you study landscape painters too, you'll start to see kind of how they were able. I know Guy actually in the comments just said, you know, Monet could tell the hour by the intensity of the light. And, you know, that's a very good thing to study. Landscape painters, you know, were way ahead of their time when they were doing this. And us as photographers can really learn a lot by studying their paintings. So now that I'm rambling, in short, my answer is to actually get out and study the light and the colors and how the landscape changes during a whole 12-hour period. Really helps. What about you, Alex?
Well, I think the dunes are a great example of how to see those different colors and start to understand them. I think it's interesting that the dunes are one color, and you can see maybe 6, 7, 8 different colors in a period of a couple hours on them. But going back to what Alistair said, I think studying those colors and then recognizing that there's kind of a range that is acceptable to the human mind, because we all experience this light and we know what sunlight looks like. And there's kind of, you can take whatever color or light it was that you were initially drawn to or that you want to accentuate, whatever you're feeling, and you can play that up. You can make it much more significant in the photo, but there's still kind of a range if you've studied the actual light that you know will look acceptable and come off as believable. So I think that's one aspect of it, working with color. And then another for me personally is just thinking about simplifying it. And this also sort of goes back to what Alistair said with the sliders. Like if you're just playing with white balance, for example, and you start warming it up and you really feel that light, then think about, okay, this is what I want to feel, this is what I want to accentuate, but how do I do it in a realistic manner? And how do I make the viewer recognize what I'm trying to make them feel? And I think for me, it's simplification. You often run into a lot of different colors in a photo, some of which are kind of close to each other but different, and you might end up with a full rainbow, and whatever you're trying to say with a certain color might not come through. So what I do, like you can even see in the photo behind me, I kind of take like different hues of cyan and blue and purple and squish them all together to blue, and like yellow, orange, red, I'll kind of decide on a warm tone. And that's not the right or wrong way to do it, but I just think that simplifying your color can make it come through better in the final product. Sarah, how about you?
Oh, I think you guys did a great job. A plus.
All right. Ken asks, how do you visualize an intimate landscape to photograph? Are you composing in your mind or through the lens? Sarah can go first this time.
I think I do a mix of the two. That oftentimes, especially with patterns, I know instantly how I'm going to frame a subject. I might test it out, or I might see something that I don't like once I get my camera set up and need to refine it. But sometimes, like, I'll just instantly know exactly what I'm going to photograph and how I'm going to frame it. Other times where so when I'm out photographing, I usually try not to bring any expectations, but instead let the landscape speak to me in the sense of like, what am I seeing that's interesting me? What connection am I having? And then if I'm having a connection, and I think that seems like that could be a really interesting photograph, then I might, but I'm not quite sure how it might work. Then I might say, well, I think this is the focal length that I might want to start with. I'll get out my camera and then I'll start experimenting through the viewfinder, because that helps bring a concept to fruition if I'm working more experimentally. So I'd say that I do a mix of both, probably a little bit more with my camera if I'm in a newer place. So if I'm less familiar with a landscape or less familiar with a subject, I might need a little bit more help with using my camera for framing, whereas if I'm in a really familiar place working with a familiar subject, it's a lot more intuitive. How about Alex?
I need a rectangle, I think, to really dial in a composition. Like I see what it is that interests me without even pulling out the camera. Going back to what we were talking about earlier, I think observation is really important. But once you're really dialed in on something and you know you want to make a photograph of it, at least for me, I really need a rectangle to start experimenting with distractions and balance. And I don't necessarily pull out the lens or the camera to do that. I sometimes use my phone just because it has a wide angle lens and you can pinch zoom and just kind of prototype images all over. Just zoom in and slap a rectangle around something. Some old school film guys use like a actual cardboard rectangle that you carry around in whatever ratio you want to shoot in. That can be helpful. But I think, you come up with, at least for me, I come up with the idea in my mind, and then I do need to see some sort of frame around it to really refine it to the point where I'm happy with it. How about you, David?
I'd say it's pretty much the same as what you said. I'm just looking around for things that catch my attention, and then I'll eventually get out the camera to start working that composition to actually see it in the frame. I'll say I do use I prefer using the live view, I guess you'd call it, to see what the actual photograph in the end is going to look like, rather than looking through a viewfinder. But I'm on mirrorless, so it's all the same now. But yeah, that's about all I have to add. Alister?
Yeah, I agree with what Alex says, is that I'll recognize what it is I want to photograph instinctively and intuitively, but the key component is that the frame is a thing. The four walls of the frame, everything within that has to have a relationship with it. So the angle that lines join the frame at, or where they join the frame, whether it's near the edge, near the corner or somewhere in the middle, there's a relationship created by the content within the frame. So a scene isn't a photograph until it's been framed. And it's that emotional relationship between the content and the frame that really creates that message and the emotion that you're trying to put across. And I use my phone all the time as well. Jennifer, you're all
muted.
Oh,
You're
you're
muted.
muted.
Sorry, the cat, of course, is running around right now, so her little collar's jingling, so I was like, I better mute myself. I really don't have much to add to that. Everyone has done such a nice job answering this, and I use pretty much the same tactics that they talked about. Using your cell phone is a great, it's a tool right here in our pockets that we can just get out really quickly and survey the land with. And yeah, like Sarah said, if it's a place that I know really well, I have a pretty good kind of eagle eye idea of what I want to focus on. Patterns, the same thing. I tend to, place them in my frame in certain ways that I'm used to. But yeah, I don't really have much to add to that. So back to you, David.
All right. This one will be quick. It's just for Sarah.
Okay.
How do you achieve the dreamy atmosphere with your macro photos? And what type of lens do you use for that?
So I use a Canon 100mm macro lens, and I just bought a Lens Baby 85 Velvet because I wanted to even up the dreaminess even more. So I've played with it once, and oh my gosh, is there a learning curve. But it definitely gives off a pretty cool, like if you're interested in abstract plant photography, it's definitely fun to play with. But when I'm using my Canon macro lens, the main way that I get the dreamy look is by photographing through something. So the example that I showed when we were doing our our photo sharing at the very beginning, that salsify plant, since it's a round seed pod, and I'm photographing something in the very middle. So I'm photographing through a bunch of the little upside down umbrella seeds to get to that middle portion that I'm photographing, and then there's something in the background as well. So I'm getting the shallow depth of field in the background and the foreground, and that adds that dreamy look. So the main way to learn how to do that is you photograph through things, whether it's leaves or other plants, and that adds the even more of that dreamy look to a shallow depth of field photograph.
Yeah, I just want to add, you'd be surprised if you put something in front of the lens, like the kind of vignette around this stuff here. That's just, it seems like you'd be blocking up your whole photo, but since it's out of focus, it just adds that kind of feel all over the entire photo.
Yeah, it's something that's super uncomfortable for landscape photographers to do because it feels like you're blocking your lens, like what Alex was saying. But it adds color and a little bit of like the dreamy abstract feel because it will be totally out of focus. So just start experimenting with photographing through things and you'll start learning how to get that effect in your own photos.
It's like Alex was saying earlier on as well with the framing, using something else to frame, you're creating a tunnel through abstract out of focus stuff to get to the key bit of the frame that you want to draw the attention to.
Right. Sean has a question. He said he listened to several of us at the Out of Chicago live event, and it seems like you started shooting more grand landscapes and then slowly matured or advanced into seeking out more intimate scenes. Would you say that seems like a more natural progression for photographers in advancing their artistic vision?
Alex and I talked about this
Yeah.
a couple of days ago on the phone. And we had a slight difference of opinion, I guess, in that I looked on it personally as an advancement. I think when you go somewhere and you shoot what's there in front of you, it's about that place. You're recognizing majesty or grandeur or expansiveness or an emotional resonance with a big place. And I think the more you start to isolate, the more you're making the photograph personal, and it's a more it's turning the lens on you more than out there. And I think intimate photography is essentially a self-exploration thing rather than more of a kind of celebration of the broader landscape. But in terms of whether that's a progression or not, I think ultimately the reason many of us tend to go down that road is that it's far easier to make images that are unique and personal, because every tiny little bit of the landscape is unique and it's yours, rather than that big picture, standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon with 500 other people. If you're shooting at 400 mil, you can find bits that are totally unique to you.
Yeah, I like to call the grand landscape obvious beauty. So it's really easy to see those things. Yeah, it's hard to create a really great composition for a grand landscape, but even if you do, it's not something that's necessarily personal to you. It's just a really nice photo of that place. So yeah, it's a lot more a personal. Yeah,
I think that kind of touches on something that in general landscape photography seems so focused on location. People are so concerned about locations, and I don't really care about location as long as I'm somewhere that has something that inspires me. And I think that the grand landscapes are, about not. This is why we had the difference of opinion, Alistair, because I was actually just trying to be diplomatic. I actually totally agree with you, but I don't think that it's an awful lot better. I don't feel like it's necessarily progression in the sense that intimate scenes are better or smaller photographs are better, or that I'm a more advanced photographer because I shoot those instead of big scenes. Like, I'm not very good at big scenes anymore, as I alluded to earlier. I don't think it's about progressing as in getting better, but it is about making photographs more personal and making them yours. Because I do feel like with most of my grand landscapes, I was just lucky to be there, or I planned to be there at the right time, and I just showed up, and I was more of a conduit for the scene, and I acceptably arranged everything in the frame, but I don't really feel like I did anything that anyone else couldn't do, or like I came away with a photo that is uniquely mine. So that's kind of why
I think that's excellently put.
yeah.
How about you, Sarah or Jennifer?
I could jump in, because when I look at my early photographs, when I was just getting started and had no idea what I was doing, I photographed a lot of small scenes. And then I think the culture of nature photography and landscape photography in the United States kind of beat that out of me in some ways, like that when you're starting to get feedback and what's resonating with people, like I was starting to get better at nature photography right when the 500 pics trend was happening, where people were voting up or down your work and really judging it based on like immediate visual impact. And I think I didn't have the self-confidence at the time to just continue with what really resonated with me most, which is generally the smaller stuff. I like doing everything, but I think I'm best and that I express myself best through the small scenes. So I think it took a process of really getting comfortable with who I am as a photographer to get comfortable with sharing that side of me, and having the confidence to say, this is who I am, and this is what I want to communicate about nature. So for me, it was a process of that's where some of my roots were, and then I went away from them, I think because I felt too much peer pressure and was looking for a lot of external validation. And then when I started moving more towards trying to understand myself through my photography and really being more interested in expressive work, that I moved back to the smaller scenes as being a bigger focus. I don't think it's necessarily like that it shows a progression towards towards more personally expressive photographs to go to the smaller scenes, because I think some people do really express themselves very well with the grand landscape. But for me, I do think my more personally expressive work is the smaller things. Jennifer.
Yeah, again, I would just be repeating kind of the same thing as everyone said. I will say that when you are starting out, Sarah mentioned, it's kind of drilled into your head, here's your wide angle, here's your tripod, now, go photograph this amazing scene, or, go like stand where Ansel Adams stood and just photograph this. And, and we all did that. I did that like the first year I started photography, and I chased those scenes. But that's how we learn. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I think it's just a natural progression, at least watching some of my students over the last few years start out with those grand landscapes, and then with each workshop or even the work they've done in between workshops, I start to see them picking apart those little details, and all of a sudden they've got a more smaller scene's focus. And I think it's because, when we first get out in the landscape, we've got that aha moment of, wow, look at this grand vista. But as we mature with our photography, by learning, how the light interacts with the landscape, what happens during storms, the quiet hours in the morning and the evening, we start to just naturally see those little moments. So we start experimenting with them. So I think sometimes it's a natural progression, just because you're becoming more aware of your environment, you're learning what to look for, and then you're picking on, what you're passionate about or what is personal to you. And then that's where you kind of start to branch off into finding, I don't necessarily want to say, your vision or style, but in a way that's kind of what it is. And that's what makes our photography all unique. So yeah, I would agree that it's a natural progression, and that's kind of how we've all ended up here.
All right. Alan has a question. What do you consider more important, light or subject, and why?
Jennifer's definitely first.
I know, I shouldn't have made a noise. My goodness. I'm thinking out loud. I'm going to give the answer that a lot of people get when they ask questions in the photography community. It depends. It depends on what I'm feeling. It depends on what I'm trying to showcase. I am drawn to, those scenes with that amazing light or spotlight or dappled light. But sometimes I zero in right on a subject. So just like that tree from Yellowstone, yeah, the mist behind and the way the light was interacting with the mist was really nice. But man, it was that tree. And that tree had a story. And I think it really just depends on the situation I'm in. If the light is doing something really amazing and I find a little story to tell there, then I'm going to go for that. Other times it's, oh my gosh, this mud crack, or, that tree, or, oh my goodness, like look at this mountain peak catching the last little bit of alpenglow. So yeah, I'll stick with, it just depends on the scene. What about you, David?
Yeah, I'll say it depends too. For me, I'm always attracted to the light first. So I'm always looking for that interesting light as a starting point, and I'll try to work something from that. And if the light isn't there, then I start to look at, actual subjects and patterns and things. Otherwise, I'm just looking for the interesting light and then looking for a subject that goes with it. So I have kind of a weird approach, I think.
Alex? Might just say that light is your subject then, and that whatever is interesting you is what's most important. If it's the light or the subject, it doesn't matter which it is. And if you're drawn into or drawn by a particular subject and it doesn't have ideal light, you can stick with it and wait and see what happens, or make an educated guess as to what's going to happen, and make the light better service your subject or your composition by taking time with it. But yeah, you could say the light is the subject. So it really depends.
Yeah.
Can I very quickly be an evangelist for shade? Because I think so many people dismiss shade and flat light as being so boring, and like I'm not photographing in boring light like that. But for some of my photographs, because I do so much work with plants and a lot of work with smaller patterns, shade can be incredibly beautiful light. So in that case, the subject would be more dominant, because the light is just kind of what it's not the main feature of like looking at the photo behind Alex. Like light is a major component of that photograph, versus if you're photographing a plant under flat light, that lets all the details of the plant shine. So I think with intimate landscapes and grand landscapes, that light can play a much more important role than with plant and flower photography, or even trees in some cases. So that there are many opportunities in all different kinds of light, and that I don't want us to walk away from this question without giving shade a little credit, because it can work really nicely with a lot of scenes.
Well, especially if your subject is overly complex. I mean, you don't want to complicate it even more with harsh shadows and bright light. And I should also add that in the grand landscape, hum-ho light is very obviously not that great. But then when you focus in on a subject that's extraordinary to you, the light, it's not immediately apparent that the light wasn't great there. So I think it becomes less important depending on what your subject is.
I guess that leaves me. My feelings with this is that anything that could be construed as a black and white answer is a wall between us and our creativity. So I think having an openness to all aspects of the world around us is ultimately the most opportune way of having a relationship with the world. Now, there's a psychology to how we see and notice things around us, and luminosity is probably the biggest driver. You know, we will get drawn to the brightest thing first. Right behind my head, there's snow, frosty trees, and where they're the brightest, that's where our eye will tend to go first. And then we'll explore other areas of luminosity through the scene. The subject for me is less important. I don't care if it's a dramatic, dynamic subject or it's a plain, ordinary, relatively boring subject. If the luminosity, contrast, atmosphere, color, and textures, etc., are all resonating with me, then I'll point my camera at it. So I think any type of black and white answer is ultimately probably going to lead us down the wrong avenue.
Right. Question from Mark. Can you talk about the balance between planning and technique and open receptivity and emotion in your photography?
I don't plan a single thing.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Alistair.
I don't plan anything at all. I'm a big guitar player. I've been playing guitar since 40 years now, I guess. And I get a lot of inspiration creatively from guitar players. And I listen to a lot of interviews with great guitar players. And one of the things they always say is that technique is preparing the vessel. You know, if you understand, you know, the way an instrument feels in your hand is learned. You have to spend time with that instrument, whether it's a guitar or a trumpet or a camera. And the more time you spend with that tool, the less it becomes alien to you. And probably in the last 5 years, when I hold a guitar, it feels different in my hands. So preparing the vessel is understanding your relationship with the tool, understanding how it sees the world, understanding how it is going to respond to what you point it at. So ultimately, technique is a foundation it's the language of photography. It's the implementation it's the conduit between seeing and recording. So I just think that the technical aspects of photography, some disciplines are far more technically demanding than others. I grew up as a bird photographer, and photographing birds in flight is a technically very demanding thing, whereas some types of landscape photography are very simple. You can literally, especially small scenes, you can more or less point your camera at them and they're there right in front of you. And there might be a few focus issues or stuff like that. So understanding what the technical limitations are of what you are seeing, I guess, is the only real challenge. And the rest of it's all composition, feeling, resonating with the content, and understanding that emotional relationship, because that's where the juice is. The techniques are just tools to get you from A to B.
Very well put.
Thank you.
I'd say I do very little planning anymore. I think that changed a lot. I used to do a lot of night photography, and that required tons of planning. It was all planned out. So you would need to know, where the Milky Way was and how it's going to line up with this mountain and how the moonlight was going to light up this mountain, what percentage you needed and all this. I don't do any of that anymore. I just go out for a hike, wander around, see what catches my eye, and photograph that. And it's just more open and freeing to just be creative instead of creating something from technical stuff.
I feel like, sorry. Jennifer.
Pretty much what David said is what we do. And, and in my mind, I head out with zero expectations. Expectations can lead to disappointment. And expectations lead to pressure, and then pressure leads to stress, and then stress does absolutely nothing but negative things for our creativity, and it boxes us in. So I will head out with zero expectations. My, you know, I mean, I don't even, you know, I guess what I should say is I'll head out with my camera, and if I make a photo that day, I make a photo. If I don't, no stress. You know, I'll see what my relationship with Mother Nature is the next day. And that's really freeing. And, you know, that's why I often tell people, you know, if you're in a rut or you're having, you know, you just don't feel that spark anymore to go out and photograph, just keep the camera gear at home and just take a hike, go out and reconnect with the root of why we got into photography in the first place. And I've had numerous ruts where I've just done that for a week or even a month. And all of a sudden, one day while sitting out in nature, it'll, you know, dawn on me again, and I'll see something exciting that I want to photograph, and, you know, kind of get out of my rut. But yeah, I don't like the stress and the pressure of that, and it really inhibits the creative process. And then the second part of his question was something about what gear do you carry, or like what lenses. I'm not the perfect technical photographer. I keep my 28-300 on my lens or my camera most of the time because, you know, I know that at 300 it can get a little softer on the corners. Who cares? At 28, I'm not quite wide enough to catch a wide scene, but who cares? It's wide enough. And I find that that is very freeing than carrying 5 different lenses around in my bag that I may or may not use. So finding a lens that has a lot of range if you're just getting started, that you just want to go out into nature and, you know, be able to connect with, that's probably one of the best little things that I've learned on my journey. But yeah, no expectations, no pressure and stress, and find a lens that you're comfortable with so you don't have to take, you know, 1,000 with you and feel that pressure. What about you, Alex?
I learned this from Sarah and David and you and Ron, hanging out with you guys. Just having no expectations and just kind of wandering around and being receptive to what's out there. That's how I operate now. I think planning just boxes you in. You're giving yourself tunnel vision. The more you plan, the less you're open to, because the more you're looking for. And so I just don't, I mean, you could call it laziness or you could call it creativity, but I just go out without any sort of plan or expectation aside from, okay, maybe this is the area I want to check out today. And as far as having the right gear on me, I only have 2 lenses that cover from 24 to 400 millimeters. So I'm pretty much set for anything I run across. I just try to keep it simple as far as gear goes. But I think being open to anything is far more important. The question was about the balance. I think it's far more important than planning, unless you're talking about a specific kind of shot that requires a lot of planning, like night photography.
Yeah, I totally agree with what everybody else is saying. The only time I plan something is if I want to go back to something I found in better or different, I'm not supposed to say better, different light than what's presenting itself at that particular time. So I think my general approach to nature photography is that I'm going to slow down, wander around, look for connections, and photograph the things that I connect with. And like what Alex was saying, I might choose a general region or a particular hike to do, but beyond that, it's purely driven by being open to what I'm seeing and what I'm connecting with on that given day.
All right. Agnieszka had a different type of question here. She asks what we're doing in the summer. She said that there's sunrises are early, sunsets are late, and the worst is that everything's just green. It's not spring fresh green, but a uniform green. She's wondering if insects are the only photographic solution for this time, and she falls into a summer sleep and wait for September.
This year is very different, I think, from previous years. Normally, my spring season is about 15 weeks of workshops. So by the time it gets around to June, because I used to do a lot of stuff in Tibet and stuff, which we typically did in June. So by the time I'd get around to July and August, I definitely was ready for a break, and I'd put the camera to one side because there would be a busy autumn season again. I think I would ignore the whole sunrise and sunset thing. Adam Gibbs and I often say that once you get to our age, getting up for sunrise is harder than it used to be. So I forget about that whole golden hour light most of the time anyway. But in terms of everything being all green, it's an excellent opportunity for black and white photography, because high contrast sunlight in a forest in the summer creates tons and tons of contrast, and you can really make those yellows and green tones shine in a black and white conversion. So the same principles of creativity still apply. Nature's out there 365 days a year, and it's who we take into the landscape is the determining factor on whether creativity is going to be delivered or not. So I don't believe that the day of the year is significant when it comes to going out and making photographs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there's millions of subjects that don't have to be specifically, fall colors or, spring trees. There's lots of different things to look at, from just, the trunk on a tree, what the bark looks like, or rock texture, or anything really. So there's
like Sarah and Alex have both been saying, in terms of using shallow depth of field and shooting through green foliage to stronger, more contrasty subjects. I've always said on workshops, there's no such thing as bad light, just a lack of imagination.
Mm-hmm.
And
I can be really harsh.
particularly with forest light, I think, because that was alluded to in the question with the greens, I don't think sunrise and sunset are particularly important in the forest, because you have the canopy filtering light. All sorts of interesting light would happen all day in the summer in the forest. Got little spotlights coming over little plants and different tree trunks going in and out of the light. And I mean, there's just focus more on the details of what's happening than what time it is.
Yeah.
And I think you'll see that there's more out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
go ahead.
I was just to say, I really can't add to anything that's already been said. Then, that's where you have to be careful and see, just from that, you're almost forming an expectation of what to expect. So just really freeing yourself from those disappointments. And I don't even like saying disappointments, but turning that negative into a positive thought. So I always use the example, it's raining outside. Well, that makes good photography. Maybe you want to get out your new set of filters that you just got and play with, slower water movement, or, waterfalls look really nice under cloudy skies. It's blue skies for the next 10 days. Perfect. Let's get out and work on textures in black and white and learning to recognize those subtle changes in the midday light. Just always being able to turn those negative thoughts into positive ones and just getting out there and exploring.
Yeah, you're pre-failing.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Kelly has.
What about
question.
Sarah, David? Because
Nothing.
we interrupted each other.
Okay.
I'm good. If we want to get through all the questions, we don't all have to answer everyone.
We're not going to get through all of them. There's lots. All right. Kelly asks, since we have all been on lockdown and unable to go out and photograph, what have you been working on, and will you continue to do it once lockdown is removed?
I can answer this super quickly. I had an ice project that actually I had going a few weeks ago, where we've had a lot of snowfall, and then it's been followed by warmer periods, and then what melts kind of refreezed overnight. So going out to get the mail one day here at the house, I came across these wonderful little abstract ice patterns, and it was the first time during this whole quarantine that it kind of sparked my interest. So I grabbed my camera, and if anyone knows me and has followed me, photo projects are huge with me. So I started a little photo project called Quarantine Ice, and I've got all these nice little cool blue, ice abstracts, and it just goes to show you don't have to go far, and photo projects are all around us. And so I've been working on that photo project, not so much now that it's like sunny and 80 today, but I have a lot of photos from that. And yeah, it's just an example of just getting out in your neighborhood and just looking for things, and maybe practicing with that macro lens that you haven't gotten to use yet, and just being open to seeing what's around you. And I'll always continue working on my photo projects even after the lockdown. Sarah?
I bought flowers at the grocery store and have been photographing them. That's working on my backlog, doing things like Out of Chicago Live and these kinds of webinars to just transition from doing in-person workshops to doing online education. So just a kind of a mix of all things related to photography. How about Alex or David? Go ahead.
I've been little too focused on business myself. I've been focused on the webinars and just finding ways to, keep us afloat through all of this. I've been photographing a tiny bit. I did get some lens babies that I want to play with some more. And know that some flowers and stuff are budding. I might get out more and do that. Alex?
I have been focused on business and webinars and teaching and all that, but I think as far as the photography goes, even when you're not shooting, you can still be progressing. I take a lot of, or I have taken a lot of hiatuses. Is that the right?
Yep.
Plural hiatuses. Hiati in my time as a photographer, because I used to live so far from the places that I wanted to shoot, and I found that every time I went back out, I had some different preference or completely changed view on some subjects or types of photos. I just feel like I'm still progressing even without shooting every day, because it's really about my own preferences inside. And so if you're still filling yourself with any kind of inspiration, if you're finding inspiration in some other form, or if you're thinking about photography or looking at photography, you're still doing something that's going to help you when you go back out. So I like to think that this time off, I'm still, coming up with ideas and progressing and how I'm going to see the world when I get back out there.
I think that leaves
Sorry,
me.
Alistair. Yeah.
I am heavily focused on online content because, like David, we need to make a living. We've lost a lot of income through the workshops being cancelled. So, throwing energy into the online situation. Yes, we'll still be doing that once we get back to our regular existence, like running workshop with Alex Noriega in October, which we're still very much hoping is going to happen. Now, I agree totally with Alex that I develop as a landscape photographer the more I understand who I am, because I think your personal development and your creativity walk hand in hand, and you can totally have fresh perspectives, fresh realizations. You can go out for a walk and see the world in a different way than you did yesterday, and that can spark new creative ideas. So I just think remaining inquisitive and joyful and childlike about the world around you is a skill that should be nurtured, because it gets beaten out of us as we get older. We're all like that as kids, running around skipping in puddles, and unfortunately when you do that as a 40-year-old, people think you're a bit crazy, but skipping in puddles is what we should be doing, because it should be a joyful thing. So yes, I will continue skipping in puddles.
All right. We're going to start directing questions towards one person because we're kind of running out of time and still have a ton of questions. I think I'll direct this one towards Sarah because I know she's done this. Tara asks, have you ever done any workshops yourself? And what was the most impactful, influential one, and why?
I have done 3 workshops with Mark Adamus, and it was right when I was just getting started as a nature photographer. And the first one in the Pacific Northwest completely changed my path with photography. I had been a backpacker and hiker before that, but seeing Mark's adventurous spirit in the field totally changed how I looked at nature. I became a lot more adventurous and was willing to take more risks and get out there more. And then by the 3rd workshop, I had realized that I'm more independent than I thought I was, and I didn't need to be doing these anymore. So I'm so glad I had that first experience, though, because being around somebody that's super adventurous like him really put me on a different path.
All right. This one's for Jennifer. Ron asks, how has your background in geology influenced your photography?
That's a good one. I know I saw that he has a similar background, so that's exciting. I would say both the geology background and the background in veterinary medicine have both influenced my photography. The world can't tell you how it forms. So with geology, we base a lot of our insights on observations of the rocks, and animals can't speak to you to tell you what's wrong. So again, it's a very observational process, and just being able to kind of be in tune with the animal. So in exchange, it's actually made me a much more observative person. So if I see sandstone, for instance, I know to look for cross bedding. from the ancient windstorms and the sand dunes, because those make, amazing little abstract, smaller images, or even going to Death Valley and seeing these geologic processes happening in real time. So I know if there's a flash flood, I know to go out and look for mud. If there's, erosion and wind happening, I kind of know where to look for those erosional remnants and features that I like to photograph. So in short, it's just made me a more observational person. And I'm more curious about the world.
All right, I'll direct this next one to Alistair. Mark asks, is vision what allows you to select a scene to photograph, or do you apply your photographic vision after deciding which small scenes you want to photograph?
Goodness me. Wowee. Wow. I don't look for photographs. I recognize things that resonate with me in some way. So I consider things, they spark what I call creative awareness. And creative awareness is like a bowl of spaghetti that there's lots of strands to it. And it's a case of, I think our skill is a way of organizing those strands into something coherent and cohesive. So I guess some of the stuff Alex has talked about in terms of simplification. So I think an awareness of the aesthetic and understanding that translation between what we see and how we can articulate that, because quite often what we're seeing is a very complex situation, but we are resonating with a simple aspect of it. And it's a case, I think the creative vision comes later to a certain extent. I don't think we make photographs in the field. I think we sketch in the field. And I talk about that on workshops a lot, is going out and making sketches of things that we're resonating with. And all we're doing is we're engaging with moments in time. And we make photographs when we're sat in front of the computer. So that's where the creativity, I think, comes into, is simplifying, articulating, adding our own personality to it. Or changing the content. Dodging and burning is basically creativity in many ways as well. So I think it's intuition first, and then some degree of conscious creative awareness comes in later.
Fantastic
That's
answer.
A good question, though.
Hard question, yeah.
Yeah, that's a very hard question.
All right, this one towards Alex. Chris asks, how has your photography changed over the last 5 years? This may include what you focus on subject-wise, where you travel to, and how you've changed your post-processing.
Well, I would say that it's definitely gotten smaller in terms of the scope of the scenes. 5 years ago, I think is about 4 or 5 years ago is when I kind of stopped focusing on bigger grand landscapes and sold my ultra-wide lens. And I think that I end up processing less as time goes on. I prefer a more restrained approach as every year comes on. And I just think that I'm distilling and simplifying more and more. But really, I think about 4 or 5 years ago is when I hit my stride on finding out what I really wanted to do. And so some of my favorite photographs are from about 4 years ago. And I'm really just kind of trying to do that while still progressing in some way.
Okay. We'll direct this one back towards Sarah. Kurt asks, what techniques do you employ in the field to be mindful of the conditions you're presented with, to calm down and be decisive in your decision-making to get some keepers instead of being overwhelmed and freaked out?
Unmute myself. So that's definitely something that's taken me a lot of practice, because I was definitely, and still sometimes am, like just see so many opportunities and then pulled in so many different ways. So I really consciously think about my style in the field as slowing down, observing, wandering around, looking for connections, and telling myself that I want to come home with 1 or 2 really good photographs, not 15 mediocre photographs. So I think those kinds of practices of just where you're coaching yourself about, like, if you catch yourself feeling overwhelmed, kind of step back, relax, and say, what's catching my eye most, and can I focus on that one thing and make a really good photograph of that one thing? One of the other things that I think can be really helpful for dealing with this is just getting out more with your camera. So if you have an open space or a park or a green space around your home, try to get out at least once a week just to practice photography. Work on composition, work on understanding light, practicing with your lenses. And I think the more you do those kinds of micro outings, the more skills you have and the less pressure you'll feel when you're on the big important trips. So those would be a couple of things that have helped me a lot in dealing with some of those same challenges.
All right, thank you, Sarah. One for Jennifer here, Irina. Do you ever feel that everything in nature has already been photographed in various manners so that it's almost impossible to not be repetitive?
It is. But again, this is kind of like, it may have, just because it was seen and photographed by someone else, it wasn't my eyes, my vision. So, I think everything in nature can be photographed more than once because we all see it differently. A good example of this real quickly is our workshops. When we conduct our workshops, we take our group out into the field. We don't line them up in a line and say, shoot this, wait for this, F8, all the camera settings. We encourage wandering and exploring. So we tell them, don't even get your camera out. And the most fascinating thing about it all is at the end of the workshop, when we're going over images, here we had 6 or 7 people at the same location photographing the same subjects, and everybody walks away with a different photo. And that's just a good example of why it, who cares if it's been, photographed? I know there are thousands of photos of mud cracks out there, but, when I photograph mud cracks, that's what I'm seeing at the moment. I'm putting myself into that photo, and that's something no one else on earth can do because it's mine. And I would say, don't worry about other people that say, this has already been photographed before, why are you wasting your time? That's ridiculous. Don't let them form how you do your photography. Be your own person, follow your own vision, stay true to who you are, and forget about the people who, say negative things. There was one guy at a conference that I went to last year that stated, there's only one photograph at each location everywhere in the world to photograph, so don't waste your time trying to, repeat what everyone's done. If it's already been done, it's done. What?
Right.
I know, it made me jump out of my seat, and David's like, I could see your blood pressure rising. Like, that's the most ridiculous statement I've ever heard in my life. So no, don't worry about what other people think. Get out there, photograph something 100 times because they'll all be 100 different experiences.
Can I just add one little point to that as well? I think Jennifer's done a really great job with that, but there's a couple of things I'd say is, in music, there's only 12 notes in Western music. Has every song been written? And there's 12 notes. And the other thing is that the life that you're living, this is it. No one else is living your life. So if you engage with something, that's yours, and it's absolutely yours 100%. So no, everything in nature has not been photographed at all.
And that's a little more true for small scenes even, because that might be your little slice of nature that no one else will ever see, literally. It could be something that no human has seen and will see.
Absolutely.
And it's very difficult for people to find it too.
All right. We're at an hour and a half, so I don't know if you guys want to keep going or if we need to get going.
I can do a little.
I can stay a little longer.
Yeah, I can stay a little longer.
Okay. All right. I'll direct this one towards Alistair. What are some things that you do to challenge yourself creatively, either out in the field or during post-processing?
Sorry, you broke up in my audio there. I didn't catch that.
So what are some things that you do to challenge yourself creatively, either out in the field or during processing?
Right. I've got quite an unorthodox approach to the whole photographic thing, in that I don't believe in rules at all. And the hardest thing to do is to forget about external validation. So I think having the confidence in your own life to ignore external validation, I think, is quite a challenge. So I challenge myself every day to not be judgmental when I'm in the field, and to not rely on external validation to make what I do feel valid. So looking on my life as valuable and looking in those moments in the landscape as being valuable in their own right. And if I'm engaging with that thing, then that's an important thing for me to doing at that time, whether a photograph comes with it or not. In terms of processing, I don't have a process. An awful lot of my YouTube channel stuff is about having no rules, having no track, having no repetitive process, not starting with the same thing every time and moving through a process and then being surprised that all our images look the same and don't say what we want them to say. So I think allowing yourself to have a relationship that's emotional and intuitive with the data in front of the computer, listening to the image so that it's telling you what's a good direction for it to go in. So atmospheric images don't want black points and white points. If we force one on it, then the nice atmospheric emotional scene suddenly becomes a very high contrasty scene, and it loses that very essence of what it was about in the first place. So I think I challenge myself every day to not listen too much to people telling me that I have to do things in a certain way, and to be happy. That's what I want to do every day. I want to wake up in the morning and feel joyful about what's in front of me, and I want to go to bed feeling as if I've added value, not just to my own life, but to hopefully the community of artists out there wanting to progress through life as well.
All right, I'll throw this one to Alex. What do you think makes an image emotional?
I think that depends on whether you're talking about the creator or the beholder of the image. What makes an image emotional for me, or what instills some emotion in me when I look at it, may be completely different for you. So I don't necessarily worry about that in so much of a rigid format. Like I don't worry about whether an image is emotional in some measurable way, or some way that can be explained. I just worry about whether it makes me feel anything, and hopefully the beholder will also feel something, even if it's completely different than what I think. But I think for me, to answer that question, it's just anything that makes me feel transported to a certain kind of atmosphere or another place, or a different time, or makes me feel longing. I just want to feel something when I look at it, and I guess that's kind of hard to articulate, and I'm still working on that. I think Alistair's a little further along on articulating emotion than I am.
We'll talk more tomorrow.
Yeah.
All right, thanks, Alex. This one towards Sarah from James. He asks, do you find small scene photography to be more amenable to cruddy light that otherwise would make poor conditions for photographing larger landscapes? And any preferences for conditions in small scene photography? You're muted, Sarah.
I just need to stop unmuting myself, or muting myself in the first place. So the first thing that I would encourage is that we get away from good light, bad light, cruddy light, and just instead look at the qualities of the light in front of us and think about how it's affecting the scenes that we might want to photograph, so that we're not placing judgment on light, but we're instead learning how to use all different sorts of lighting conditions. Generally, if you have shade or gray overcast or less dynamic light, that can be very good for photographing things like patterns and repetition, and landscapes that have layers and plants and all sorts of trees, that you can still do a lot with that kind of flat light. I think it's just having a different vision for the types of photographs that come out of that kind of situation. So I generally would encourage you, if you're thinking about like, what do I do when light is bad? It would be more to say, well, now's the time for me to potentially look to the smaller details of nature. So that goes back to some of the observational skills that we were talking about earlier. Like, if you're connecting with something, like, is the light favorable to photographing it? Or maybe opening your mind to say, this might not have been what I envisioned, but maybe this still could create an interesting image with maybe in black and white or some other alternative. So I think that just generally bringing a more expansive view and then looking for opportunities based on what's happening can help improve your experience and your ability to see opportunities in a really broad range of scenes. But I will add one other thing about grand landscapes. A few of my favorite photos of grand landscapes were taken on clear days, way before sunrise or way after sunset, because the light on certain landscapes, especially in deserts, can look absolutely fantastic at twilight. Just the pinks and blues that you get on the landscape can be fantastic. So that's something that I often hear people talking about as bad conditions. And I think it's really about opening your mind and seeing that sometimes simple can work really well, and that not having any clouds in the sky, that can be okay on certain days.
All right. Here's a bit of a different question. I'll direct this towards Jennifer. Don't be scared. John asks, all of you do photo tours. What's the biggest challenge you face bringing groups of people into remote areas that are sensitive to human impact? And especially those that particularly want to check off their shot list and aren't necessarily familiar with outdoor ethics and preservation.
Go for it, Jennifer.
Yeah. Woo. Well, first, David and I, and actually Sarah, were the co-founders of the Nature First photography movement, which was started about 2 years ago. The brainchild of a few Colorado photographers that were just tired of seeing some of our favorite places just getting utterly destroyed, and realizing that we all can be better ambassadors, including ourselves, to the lands that we teach on and that we love. So the first, two things. We don't take workshops to places that are extremely delicate and fragile. That's just, and I know a lot of other workshop leaders, including, Alex even, and I'm sure Alistair too. We all really work hard to protect that. Second, the first slide when we do our presentations on the first night encompasses all the Nature First principles. So we educate our clients about those and encourage them to, pass on the principles to their friends, and, because we can all be better stewards. And then when we're out in the landscape, I'm just going to pick on Death Valley, we'll explain, we're going out to the sand dunes. Yes, we're leaving footprints, but in the next wind, these are going to be completely erased, so it's not permanent damage. Versus there are a few basins in Death Valley that are a lot more delicate that we tend not to take people to because of the footprints. Or if it is a little muddy, we'll tell everyone, let's go out in a single file line, try to follow in each other's footprints. This place does get flooded frequently, so they will disappear. We just try to do, little tasks like that to kind of help encourage people and, educate themselves. And, we feel that we're doing a pretty good job, and we're pretty proud of the fact that we do try to educate those principles and instill them on, because the next location they visit, they'll have those in the back of their mind, and we hope that they, follow those principles. And not only that, but maybe they'll see someone else that's about ready to walk out into the tundra and say, hey, I know you want to go over there, but, these little plants are super sensitive and they take, hundreds of years to grow. And that's just kind of what we hope, even more than coming away with a good photo, that they at least just get an appreciation for those things from our workshops. Did I kind of answer that, David? Was there another part to that?
No,
there was a second part of that which I'd just like to quickly jump in on, which is this about other people's expectations and a checklist of certain photographs. I virtually never get people on my workshops with those types of expectations, because I think there's who you are as an online person, the type of images you make, and the writing. I mean, I write a lot for On Landscape magazine, for example, NPN articles. And I think who you convey yourself to be online and the type of photographs that you make, you don't tend to attract the sort of icon tickers particularly. So most people, it used to be the worst thing on a workshop was trying to manage other people's expectations. But now we don't tend to get any of that anyway. So yeah, and I agree totally with Jennifer. You just don't take workshops to fragile environments.
And I would say we attract very few of those people, but when we do, we use it as an opportunity to educate them not only on, outdoor ethics, but also showing them new ways to see and showing them how to photograph smaller scenes instead of just getting focused on the grand landscape only.
Stealing all the rest e-cards is a really good way too.
All right. Want to answer one more there, Alistair?
Sure, yeah.
Al asks, how do I look with new eyes at places that I've been to many times near my home and now take for granted? How do I get excited about them again since I can't travel far right now?
That's an extremely difficult question because I'm going to make a massive confession here. It's late, just as a caveat to that. I had a guy in a workshop, very, very good friend of mine. He'd been on like 3 or 4 workshops. So the answer to his question has to be taken in context. And he said to me one day, he said, Alistair, how can I make more interesting photographs? And I said, start by becoming a more interesting person. Now that is totally out of context, but the root of the root of the answer is honesty, which is you'll find things fascinating if you are open to being fascinated. If you're so familiar with something, then you can become blind to the details. I think you go out expecting what you're going to see to a certain extent. I mean, running workshops. I mean, Alex and I are going to be doing something in the west of Scotland in October, and I'm going back to beaches that I've been to, in some cases, numerous dozens of times. I mean, maybe even 100 times. Now, Alex is going there for the first time, and I might be going there for the 100th time. But every time I go, I'll find something different, always, because if you're not looking for things, if you go into the landscape looking for something, you'll only find what you're looking for. And that means if you go in looking for, I've been here 50 times, I'm not going to find anything new, then that's probably going to be the outcome. Whereas if you go in and you allow the landscape to the quiet voice of the landscape, because it's the quiet voice that's harder to hear. And the only way you can listen to that quiet voice is to go in very open-minded. So I think realistically, no expectation, no judgment, and allow for the opportunity of fascination to come into that scene. So yeah, not taking things for granted. It's like a 40-year marriage. Why do people stay together that long if they're not prepared to see something new in the person they love every day?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, that's very nice.
Yeah, that was a nice.
Well, I think it's getting late and people are starting to drop off. Should we wrap it up with that?
Yeah,
let's end it with Alistair.
I'm good. I mean, it's 11:15 here, so I'm getting close to getting ready for bed for sure.
Yeah. Okay.
You guys can always email us your questions too. I know David and I would be more than happy to answer those. Or everyone else would too. So please reach out.
Yeah, sorry we couldn't get to everything, but there was a lot of questions. There's still a lot we didn't get to.
Yeah, thanks
absolutely.
everybody.
Yeah, thank you for coming.
Thoroughly enjoyed it, and lovely to hang out with these other 4 wonderfully inspiring people.
Thanks, Alistair. It's good hanging out with you too.
Likewise, definitely. Thank you guys for joining us, and thank you all to the attendees for your great questions and taking time out of your day to hang with us. During these challenging times, it's fun to see familiar faces and new names and interact with you guys since we can't be out there in the field with you. So thank you for that. And Alex and I will speak tomorrow.
All right. See you tomorrow, Alistair.
Cheers, man.
All right. Everyone take care.
Yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.